Everyone covering this story is telling you the same thing. Zorin OS hit 3.3 million downloads because Windows 10 died. Microsoft ended support on October 14, 2025. Millions of users with hardware that cannot run Windows 11 panicked. They needed somewhere to go. Zorin OS was there. It looked like Windows, and the numbers exploded. That narrative is true, but it is incomplete. And the incomplete version misses something that is actually more interesting and more important than a lucky distribution being in the right place at the right time. Because here is what that narrative does not explain. There are dozens of Linux distributions that benefit from Windows refugees. Ubuntu has been the first Linux that people try for 20 years. Linux Mint has been the standard recommendation for Windows converts for a decade. Yet it is a small Irish distribution maintained by two brothers, Artyom and Kirill Zorin, that grew from 0 to 3.3 million downloads in 6 months. Not in a decade. 6 months? And 75% of those downloads came from Windows machines. That does not happen by accident. It does not happen because of timing alone. It happens because Zorin OS solved a problem that every other Linux distribution treated as someone else's job. And understanding what that problem is and how Zorin solved it tells you more about where Linux is actually headed than any benchmark or market share statistic. The problem nobody else wanted to solve. The conventional approach to Linux distribution development has always been build the operating system, document it well, and let users figure out the transition themselves. The community resources are there. The forums exist. Tutorials are abundant. If a Windows user wants to switch, they can learn. That philosophy produced technically excellent distributions and consistently mediocre adoption rates outside of developers and enthusiasts. The problem with that philosophy is that it misunderstands why most Windows users do not switch. It is not because Linux is too hard. It is not because Linux lacks features. It is because the psychological friction of switching operating systems is enormous, and that friction is almost entirely concentrated in a single moment. The moment a Windows user tries to do something they always did on Windows and discovers it works differently, or does not work at all, or requires a search that leads to a forum post from 2019 that may or may not still be relevant. Most distributions address this at the interface level. They make the taskbar look like Windows. They put the application launcher in the bottom left. They use familiar icons and folder structures. Zorin OS does all of this, and it does it better than almost anyone else. The Zorin Appearance tool lets users choose desktop layouts that replicate Windows 10, Windows 11, or Mac OS down to the exact placement of every interface element. But interface familiarity is not what Zorin OS's 3.3 million downloads are really about. The interface has been there since the project's earliest versions. What Zorin OS 18 added, and what version 18.1, released in April 2026, significantly expanded, is something entirely different. It is the first operating system on any platform that has built a guided migration system directly into the OS itself. What Zorin OS actually built. When a Windows user downloads a Linux distribution and installs it, one of the first things they do is try to install the software they rely on. They have the installer for Plex. They have the installer for their VPN client. They have the installer for a productivity tool they have used for years. They double-click the .exe file on their new Linux machine. And on most Linux distributions, nothing happens, or worse, something breaks, and they spend an hour trying to understand why. Zorin OS 18.1 built a solution that no other Linux distribution has attempted at this scale. When you run a Windows executable on Zorin OS, the operating system does not fail silently or throw a technical error. It checks the file against a database of over 240 popular Windows applications, identifies what you're trying to install, and opens a dialog that tells you exactly how to get that application on Linux, usually pointing to the native Linux version in the software store. When a user tries to run the Plex installer, Zorin OS redirects them to the Linux Plex version, which installs correctly in one click. When a user tries to run the Microsoft Outlook installer, Zorin OS suggests Evolution Mail, the closest functional equivalent, and explains why. That 40% expansion in the app detection database that came with 18.1 is not a minor version bump. It represents a systematic effort to document the migration path for every common Windows application and embed that guidance directly into the user's first experience of trying to do what they normally do. The Medium article that tracked these migrations described it as the first distro update that treats migration as a guided, user-facing process rather than a technical project. That description is precise. Every other Linux distribution treats the application migration problem as user education. Zorin OS treats it as product design. This is the real reason for 3.3 million downloads, not the timing, the design philosophy, the numbers in context, what they actually mean. Let us be precise about what 3.3 million downloads means and what it does not mean, because responsible coverage of this story requires the honest version. The milestone breakdown Zorin OS 18 launched on October 14th, 2025, the exact same day Microsoft ended Windows 10 support. In the first few weeks, 780,000 downloads came from Windows systems. By January 2026, the total had crossed 2 million, with more than 75% originating from Windows machines. By mid-April 2026, coinciding with the release of Zorin OS 18.1, the total reached 3.3 million. Windows Central described it as one of Linux's biggest growth stories in 2026. What downloads measure is intent and curiosity. A download means a Windows user reached for a Linux ISO instead of paying for new hardware or extended support. It does not automatically mean a permanent switch. It does not guarantee that the downloaded ISO was installed or that the installation lasted beyond a week. The Linux community has a word for people who install a distribution, use it for a few days, and return to Windows, distro hoppers. Every adoption wave produces them. The honest analyst's question is not how many downloaded, but how many stayed. That number is harder to measure. Zorin OS does not publish active user counts. The download statistics come directly from the Zorin Group's own reporting, which counts ISO downloads and may include multiple downloads from single users, virtual machine installations, and automated crawlers. These are the standard caveats that apply to every Linux distribution's self-reported download figures. But there is contextual evidence that suggests this wave is more durable than the typical curiosity spike. Steam's Linux gaming market share hit 5.33% in March 2026, a metric that requires sustained use, not just installation. Linux desktop market share globally reached 4.7% in 2025, up from 2.76% in 2022, a 70% increase over 3 years. These are not download figures. These are active usage metrics from independent tracking. The broader Linux adoption trend is real, sustained, and directionally consistent with what Zorin OS's downloads suggest. And Zorin OS 18.1 being designed explicitly to improve user retention, reducing the friction that causes first-week abandonment, is the product response to exactly this challenge. Who is actually downloading it? The 4 groups. Understanding. The 3. 3 million number requires understanding who those people are, because they are not a single demographic. The largest group is users whose hardware cannot run Windows 11. Microsoft's TPM 2, 0, and CPU generation requirements locked out an estimated 240 to 400 million otherwise functional PCs. These users were given 3 official options: buy new hardware, pay for extended security updates as a 1-year bridge, or run an unsupported operating system. Zorin OS represented a 4th option that Microsoft did not offer. Keep your existing machine, keep it secure with full software updates, and run an operating system that looks and works similarly enough to Windows that the transition is not a complete relearning exercise. The second group is users pushed out by Windows 11's direction rather than hardware incompatibility. Users who installed Windows 11 on compatible hardware and found the Start menu ads, the mandatory Microsoft account requirement, the forced Copilot integration, the Windows recall controversy, and the forced updates, on an algorithm-controlled schedule to be collectively unacceptable. For this group, Zorin OS represents a principled exit from a platform that has changed its relationship with users in ways they did not consent to. The third group is budget-conscious households and small organizations facing the cost arithmetic of hardware replacement at scale. A small school, a nonprofit, a family with 4 computers. For all of these, the choice between spending thousands on new hardware to stay on a supported Windows version and spending nothing to run a free maintained operating system on existing hardware is not difficult when the interface is familiar enough to reduce training costs. The 4th group, smaller but worth acknowledging, is the technically curious. People who had been Linux curious for years but had never had a concrete external reason to try it. The Windows 10 end of life gave them one. Zorin OS's design lowered the barrier enough that curiosity translated into action. What Zorin OS 18 1 actually is the technical details. The timing of this video aligns with a significant update. Zorin OS 18.1 was released on April 15th, 2026, 3 weeks before this recording. It is worth being specific about what the update actually contains because it represents a meaningful evolution of the product, rather than a routine maintenance release. The operating system base was updated to Ubuntu 04, 4 LTS with the Linux 6, 17 HWE kernel and Mesa 25, 2 graphics stack, the latest available from Ubuntu's hardware enablement program. The upgrade means current GPU drivers, current kernel features, and a hardware support baseline that covers the most recently released PC hardware. LibreOffice 26. 2 is included, bringing Markdown support, improved connector shape objects, and better Microsoft Office document compatibility for the core productivity use case that most Windows migrants depend on. The Windows app detection expansion from 170 to 240 supported applications is the headline feature for this release, a 40% increase that systematically addresses the most common migration friction points. The expansion was targeted specifically at high-traffic Windows applications, popular media software, productivity tools, communication clients, and entertainment platforms. Advanced window tiling received 3 new behaviors. Tiled windows can come to the foreground together when switching from the taskbar. Tiling layouts can be reordered from the edit dialog. And edge tiling now snaps to custom layouts rather than simple screen halves. These improvements target the power user segment that values desktop productivity alongside the ease of use features that attract migrants. The Zorin OS Lite edition returned after being absent from the 18X series. Lite is built on XFCE 4.20 and is specifically designed for older, lower-spec computers, the exact hardware profile of millions of machines that cannot run Windows 11 but still function perfectly well. The return of Lite is a direct product response to the demographic reality that a substantial portion of Zorin's download base is people with older hardware. Lite adds fingerprint reader support, redesigned desktop themes, and a redesigned file manager. Right-to-left script support for the taskbar and panel was expanded, making the desktop consistent for Arabic, Hebrew, and Urdu users, a signal that the Zorin team is thinking about global adoption beyond the English-speaking markets where most Linux coverage is concentrated. Security support through June 2029 is the practical guarantee that makes this a serious long-term alternative rather than a temporary fix. A user who installs Zorin OS 18. 1. Today knows they have more than 3 years of maintained patch software ahead of them without any mandatory hardware upgrade. This is the most important and least certain part of the story. Downloads measure intent, retention measures reality. The factors working in Zorin OS's favor are structural. The Windows app detection system reduces the first week abandonment trigger that catches most Linux migrants. The familiar interface removes the cognitive friction that makes people reach for what they know. The Ubuntu LTS base means that community support resources, Stack Overflow, Ask Ubuntu, the broader Ubuntu ecosystem, apply to Zorin OS problems, giving users a vast existing knowledge base to draw from when they get stuck. The software support through 2029 removes the time pressure that might otherwise drive users back to Windows. The factors working against retention are equally structural. Application compatibility remains a real constraint for specific professional software. Adobe Suite has no Linux version. AutoCAD has no Linux equivalent. Enterprise software built specifically for Windows does not migrate automatically. The Zorin OS app detection system addresses 240 popular applications, the long tail of specialized software it cannot address. Users whose workflows depend on Windows-only professional tools will find a ceiling. The honest picture is that Zorin OS is most likely to retain users whose daily computing involves web browsing, office productivity, media consumption, light creative work, and communication tools, a description that applies to the majority of consumers and a significant portion of small business users. For this population, the migration friction is manageable, and the reasons to stay, no ads, no forced updates, no Microsoft account requirement, no recall feature, hardware running faster with lower resource overhead, are concrete and daily. For professional, creative, and enterprise users, Zorin OS is a partial solution rather than a complete replacement. The two-machine approach, Linux as the primary system for 80% of work, with Windows available in a virtual machine for the remaining 20%, is increasingly common among users who have made the transition successfully. The title of this video says, The 3 million download story is not what you think. Here is the honest version. The surface story is, Windows 10 died, Zorin OS was ready, millions of users downloaded it. That story is true. The deeper story is, for the first time in the history of Linux desktop distributions, one project decided that the migration experience itself was a product problem worth solving. Not a documentation problem, not a user education problem, but a product design problem that the operating system should handle by default. And the market responded to that decision in 6 months, in a way that 20 years of Linux advocacy, documentation, and community support had not achieved. The 3 million downloads are not a reaction to Windows 10's death. They are a verdict on that product decision. And the 18, one release, expanding the app detection database by 40%, adding fingerprint support to older hardware, returning the Lite edition for ineligible machines, supporting 3 more years of security updates, is Zorin OS doubling down on the same bet. The question is not whether 3 million people downloaded it. The question is, what happens when a Linux distribution stops treating migration as the user's problem and starts treating it as its own? The answer, so far, is 3 million downloads in 6 months and counting.